Today on Better Book Clubs, why reading more isn't better. For the past 10 years, I've been setting myself a goal of reading 30 books a year. Now, that may not sound like very much to a lot of people, but for me it was a lot because I was in the middle of working a couple of jobs, raising kids. I was super busy. And so if I could read 30 books in a year, I felt like I was doing really well. I would always use Goodreads to set up my challenge, and I would keep track of it that way. And I did only meet my challenge 2 years out of those 10, but I came really close every year. And this year I'm actually on track to meet it again. Not surprisingly, because pandemic. The thing is that now my kids are pretty much grown up, and I find that I have more time on my hands. I could be reading more. But I'm inclined now to skip the reading challenge. So today I want to talk to you about why. Because more isn't necessarily better. I think there's an interesting generational phenomenon at play here. I find that younger readers who are really readers, who love to read, tend to read more books. They tend to devour books, and maybe that's partly a genre thing as well. So if you're reading in a genre like romance or fantasy, you might be able to read books faster than somebody who's trying to read more literary novels. But I think there's also an interesting generational divide, because I was talking with my daughter recently about the sheer number of books that were available to her generation as children versus the number of books that were available to my generation as kids. Growing up in the 1970s, we didn't have big, long series coming out where we would wait for the next book to come out. In fact, buying books, at least for me as a kid, was a really big deal. So I didn't even own that many books, but the books I owned, I felt really proud of having, even though they were just inexpensive paperbacks, because I didn't have very many of them. And a lot of the books that I read as a kid were actually books that had been published in generations earlier. So, for example, Beverly Cleary was a really famous writer of series of kids' books that I was reading in the 1970s, but a lot of her books had been published a decade or two earlier. And so we were reading backlisted, what would be considered today backlisted books. So I think the sheer volume of books that have been available to millennials and Gen Z as kids has really kind of changed reading habits, not to mention the role that technology might be playing in this. But I would always just read to read. So even when I was in a reading challenge, when I had posted it on Goodreads that I was going to try and read 30 books in the year, I would really just read to read. And often that would include reading some big tome, some big long classic novel. Usually it was a classic. And I wouldn't even worry about it because I'd be like, oh, I'm going to meet my goal or not. Who really cares? And then I would find myself in around mid-November starting to pay attention to how many books behind I was on my goal. And as a result, I would start finishing books that I had half finished sitting around, maybe a short story collection that I had been reading all year, or I would try to look for shorter books or a novella that I wanted to read and just kind of squeeze it in so that by the end of the year I would meet my goal. The thing is, when we prioritize quantity over quality, it changes our reading, and not for the better. Reading is a uniquely meditative act. It's something that we do alone. Even if we're going to go talk about the book with somebody else later, it's a lonely pursuit. And I mean lonely in a positive way. It's something that we do by ourselves. We really get inside our heads and inside the heads of the characters, and we escape from the world around us. Anytime we get involved in a book, we really don't know where we are. So it's a very kind of meditative, escapist thing to do. You don't want to rush that. You want to be able to sit inside it and enjoy it. It also takes a certain willingness to commit to that. If you're going to read some big, longer book like Anna Karenina or Ulysses or Infinite Jest, which I mentioned because that's one of the big books that I still haven't quite worked up my courage to read. That takes a sort of willingness on your part to say, I'm going to make a commitment to this book, and it might take me half the year to read or all year to read, but I'm going to do it because I know that the experience of reading it is going to make it totally worthwhile. One of the other great things about reading is when you have the time to slow down and flip back and forth in a book, when something happens in one spot and you think, oh wow, that reminds me of something earlier, and you kind of flip back through the book, or you pause to maybe look something up that you want to learn more about. I mean, those things take time, and so if you put yourself on a schedule and you're really under pressure to read more, you're going to sort of be discouraged to try those things. You're going to miss the opportunity to really savor the book that you're reading. And there's also the element of serendipity, kind of wandering from one book to the next. Having a book remind you of something or raise an issue that you think, oh wow, I'd like to read more about that, and just kind of wandering off down the path. We talk about going down the rabbit hole, and the same thing can happen when you're reading, if you're reading in a relaxed sort of way and you're willing to kind of follow that garden path wherever it's going to lead you. These are the joys of reading, and they're joys that you can't really experience if you're rushing through everything that you read. Now look, it's possible to find joy in amassing things, in making lists of things, in setting up challenges for yourself, in being able to say, I read these 30 books this year, or these 50 books, or I read a book every day this month, or I read 300 books this year. But that's not so much the joy of reading as it is the joy of collecting. And so you might want to just give some thought to which of those things you're really experiencing as a reader, and whether you might like to try slowing down a little bit. So just be clear, I'm not telling anybody not to set up challenges. They can be really fun. I don't know yet whether I'm going to set up a 2021 reading challenge for myself. And I do know that because I'm on track to meet my 2020 reading challenge, I'm probably going to, if I'm not on track by December, squeeze in some of those shorter reads or half-done reads in order to meet my goal. But just keep in mind the possibility that it might also be more enjoyable to read more the way you probably did as a kid, to just curl up with a good book and not worry whether it fits on your list or meets your goal. Just enjoy reading for reading. I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.